Bum, ba, ba, da, ba, da, ba, ba, bum. As the song progressed, Arimu joined in on thumb piano, improvising, syncopating, subdividing, celebrating. He handed me a marimba-like instrument tuned in fourths. I quietly tapped the mallet to the keys to get a feel for the harmony, and then let loose, abandoning fear, letting go of self-consciousness, doing things my Russian piano teacher had never taught me, letting my heart speak. Many notes were wrong, some notes were right. A small crowd gathered, anarchists, after-school kids. This was my first street performance. I was hardly a master of improv, and yet there I learned one of the most essential lessons of art, the unquantifiable dance between control and freedom, between virtuosity and naivete, between relaxation and precision. It is how I write plays, this method I learned improvising there next to Dalak Ethiopian and Lee's Deli and cheesesteaks. At the end of our jam session, Arimu handed me the tape. Quiara, study this, then pass the cassette along. People got to hear this. He had little money, but always an allotment for batteries for his tape player, and he gave his songs free to the youth of an entire neighborhood. Arimu taught me to value what many might label trash. He showed me not only can you turn garbage to gold, but the fundamental nobility of that endeavor. I took my first music lesson in 8th grade. My Aunt Linda paid for it. Dolly Krasnopolsky had nothing but the highest standards. She would not entertain fools and was the first to call me out for slacking off or for falling short of my potential. My abuela gave me unconditional love. Dolly gave me tough love. Talk about calluses on my fingertips. Pianists are not supposed to have calluses. She banged my fingers into those keys so hard. Quiara dir, every finger is a different member of the orchestra. Quiara dir, your pinky is the piccolo. Tweet, tweet, tweet. Quiara dir, your thumb is the bassoon. Blah, blah, blah. Out of sheer frustration, I sometimes wanted to yank my hands from her firm, correcting grip and yell, "Get off my damn piccolo and bassoon!" Out of sheer high school exhaustion, I often wanted to fall asleep right there on the piano bench. And then she would command, "Quiara dir, do you want to go put on pajamas and come back? Play the etude again." Did I pursue a career in music? No. But did I learn how to structure my independent thinking and time? Did I come to treasure solitude? Did I learn to hear the knowledge of an elder? Did I realize the direct correlation between work hours and achieving goals? Did countless recitals teach me how to stand on a stage and face an audience with grace, poise, gratitude, and purpose? I'll let you all be the judge of that. Did I find soulmates and confidants in Chopin and Rachmaninoff and Bach, in their melancholy virtuosity? Honestly, paralyzed by middle school and high school depression, I sometimes think Chopin saved my life, because his nocturnes helped me articulate and release the sorrow I harbored in my marrow. Articulate and release. Articulate and release. That could be the title of my autobiography. Learning to play piano was certainly a fringe benefit of piano lessons. But I'll be damned if I didn't learn how to live as a writer, how to become a self-directed devotee of craft in that tiny room filled by a baby grand and an even grander Russian woman. I heard my first African drum and Puerto Rican cuatro in elementary school. As Mom brewed café con leche on our gas stovetop, she blasted that worn-out cassette of Babatunde Olatunji, a master drummer from Lagos State, Nigeria. Ire, ire, odunde. Ire, ire, odunde, odunde, odunde. By the time Mom was out of the shower and had done her wet hair with the scalding curling iron and it was time to starch Papi's button-down shirt with Niagara spray, that tape had ended. So into the stereo she popped Ramito from Caguas, Puerto Rico. Llegamos aquí por esta paranda, llegamos aquí por esta paranda, toca que se toca, anda que se anda, toca que se toca, anda que se anda. Remember cassettes? how they'd get so worn out, proof of a daily commitment to those songs and rhythms, and then they'd break and you'd have to find a new tape, which would usher in a new chapter of your morning commute or dinner preparation. African drum, Puerto Rican cuatro. The two musics that woke me up, that created the starting line of my youthful days. You are African, you are Puerto Rican, my mother seemed to be saying. This is your story, the rhythm whispered in my ear. Find the connections, the songs dared. The first public dance performance I ever saw. In middle school, Mom drove me over the Spring Garden Bridge every morning, and there she was, dancing on the sidewalk, Kathy Chang. Freak, people said. Crazy, people said. Hero, I swooned. Part activist, part performance artist, 100% nonconformist, Kathy Chang waved her hand-sewn flags that spoke of peace, justice, and democracy. She danced in swirling kicks and fluid arms. Her outrageous costumes varied from American flag pasties to hand-painted kaftans. Unemployed, clearly. Skinny. Had she eaten recently? For 3 years, every morning on the way to school, I relied on Kathy Chang, on her ongoing protest dance, to snap me into my senses, to shake up my lazy brain. 3 years later, after I had left Philadelphia, many years later, after I had left Philadelphia, I opened the newspaper to read that a mentally ill performance artist named Kathy Chang had self-immolated in front of the Peace statue on the Penn campus. Freak, people said. Crazy, people said. Hero, my heart insisted, and still does to this day. I witnessed my first ritual sacrifice at 7 in a Santeria ceremony in our West Philly living room, the first of many such experiences that terrified me and compelled me, that spoke clearly to me, soul is no easy thing. Blessings come with burdens. And how to reconcile those bata drums and bloodlet birds with the Quaker meeting I frequented on Sunday mornings. How to reconcile peace with blood, silence with chant, and how to reconcile both of those rituals with the sacred ritual of theater in my mischievous playwriting hands. I read my first beat poet, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, in 9th grade. Talk about floodgates swinging open. In one summer, I devoured the entirety of Allen Ginsberg and all his compatriots. But actually, I didn't know floodgates from leaky faucets until senior year when Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man yanked me by the nape of my neck, looked me square in the eyes, and told me a secret. That fiction articulates our nation's actual character better than my high school history textbooks did. That storytelling can rip off the facade of fact and reveal the guts beneath who we claim to be. Ralph Ellison, I read you like a Bible, I devoured you like a meal. As far as I knew, and as far as the editors of my high school Norton anthology seemed to know, Latino novels, poems, and plays were non-existent. Sorry, correction, my Norton anthology had one William Carlos Williams poem about a plum. I love that poem. But I grappled with my Americanness by reading Black novelists and Southern Gothic novelists and beat poets. And so my body became the body electric. And so my shoulder became Ginsberg's queer shoulder. And so I worked in Ralph Ellison's paint factory, mixing one black drop into bucket after bucket of white paint. I would go visit my cousins in North Philly, reading Flannery O'Connor on the L train north, witnessing the poverty get worse with every stop, and think, my cousins are the American story. My cousins are not in this Norton anthology. Who is going to tell my cousin's story? Another first. Around 2009, I returned to Philadelphia to interview a cousin for a new play I was writing on addiction. As I drove into North Philly, the sights were familiar. Some nice blocks, many crumbling blocks. Burned out homes, abandoned storefronts, hydrants open, teenage boys on corner stoops, abuelas fanning themselves in living room windows, all 4 miles north of where the Constitution of the United States of America was signed. I sat in my cousin's living room as she fried me the last egg in her kitchen. Her cabinets were barer in a way mine had never been, not a day in my life. She spoke to me about what drove her into addiction, the physical and emotional abuse she had experienced, the confusion about her sexuality, the daily reality of a neighborhood infested by drugs, and, bluntly put, how good drugs made her feel. She spoke to me about what helped in her long journey toward recovery and sobriety, the NA meetings, the sober boyfriends. She had always been a hero to me because she had stood at the brink of total self-destruction and yet instead chose the long, mundane task of survival. In her living room, soaking up her body humor and sad tales, the artist in my soul was aflame. I had to tell this story, its loops, its ebbs, its raucous femininity, its mundane, routine redemption. But then our interview was interrupted by blue and red lights flashing in through her blinds and dancing across the living room walls. We looked out her screen door, 2 cop cars and a paddy wagon. The police had already disappeared into whatever house they went into to make whatever arrest they were going to make. What else is new? That's just another day in el barrio, Kiki, my cousin said, waving it off with the flip of her hand. Pay it no mind. But then the cops emerged across the street from a familiar house, a house where some other cousins and aunts and an aunt lived. Side note, Latino families often live in proximity. And who did the cops have in shackles? 2 of my teenage cousins. Brown boys, cuffs, something about drugs and guns, serious shit, scary shit, same old shit. As those cousins of mine were led to the paddy wagon, one kept his head bowed to the ground, but the other glanced up and caught my eye. He saw Quiara, the one who got out, the one who stands tall, the anointed, the learned, and that glance contained an entire canyon between our lives, and also the lovely real memories we shared. And after a very quick moment, a kind of shame washed over his face, and he quickly looked back at the sidewalk and was loaded into the paddy wagon and was driven away. After the police vehicles left and the neighbors retreated back into their living rooms, the cousin I had been interviewing said, "I'm sorry, Kiki, but can we finish the interview another day?" She was silent now. She had withdrawn and retreated into herself. You see, she was the mother of the boy who had met my gaze, the queen of recovery and the prince of the street corner, mother and son. We never finished the interview. Fast forward 3 years later to 2012. The play I wrote based on that interview, called Water by the Spoonful, won the Pulitzer Prize in drama. I was the first Latina to win that award. My mom screamed and wept. She admonished me, "Do not forget where you come from." My husband practically hyperventilated. My agent he was going nuts on the phone. And as I drove home from that long day of teaching, I remembered my little cousin was still in prison. On the day when this play of mine was launched, a Puerto Rican boy's freedom was taken away. How could I make sense of that? I finally got home and ordered a ton of sushi, and friends began arriving with champagne, and we celebrated all night. I laughed and smiled so much. My sister has a photo from the evening, and she teases me about how shamelessly happy I look and how radiant my smile is. This is not an anecdote about being the first Latina to win the Pulitzer. Long after the prize was announced, I received a manila envelope. Inside, 90 pages, a handwritten manuscript. My cousin had written his first novel while in prison. 90 pages of handwritten words, a young man's first literary expression. He wanted me to read it because he said I had inspired him. But of course, all of the problems and promises of his spirit inspire me. How exactly are the flames of artistry stoked? What is the precise logic by which a community bands together through street dance? How is joy manifested into art? How is a neighborhood's history passed down through story and song? When is the moment a child's soul is set to dancing? Where do you find the true pulse of community art? On street corners and in lesson rooms. Art is passed from hand to hand like recipes from abuela a nieta, grandmother to child. There are only occasionally agendas and memos involved in such moments. How do grantmakers harness this unquantifiable magic, this alchemy that happens between individuals over lifetimes or in wildly unpredictable moments? How can a calendar year grant cycle fund the long arc of a child's growing self-identity, or an artist's developing voice, or a community's defiant protest? How do you, as grant makers, as angels of the arts, as the kind of people who have literally made it possible for me to stand here today and call myself a playwright, how do you systematize what is as slippery as glitter and as ethereal as an improvised rhythm? Part 2, a linear timeline of my fellowship firsts, or why my marrow can afford to tell stories. I got my first fellowship when I was an undergrad. Though I had an aunt to pay for piano lessons, I didn't have a family member with the means to underwrite Yale University. My parents hadn't graduated from college, so none of us had any clue about the costs that were involved. Though I got fantastic financial aid, there was a lot of tuition left to pay, and that responsibility fell on my shoulders. This meant putting in 20 or 30-hour work weeks in addition to my full-time course load. This meant working full-time during summers, while other classmates took unpaid internships or humanitarian trips abroad. At the end of sophomore year, I received the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship. And there were 4 things about this award that have had a lasting impact for me. 1, length. It provided 2 years of support. It didn't just help me realize one project, it subsidized an entire arc of my development as a thinker and scholar. 2, quantity. It provided enough money that I didn't have to take a paid job during the summer. This meant 2 summers I could afford to write full-time. 3, quality. It didn't require that I account for the funds provided. I could do what I needed or wanted with the money, in my case, pay for tuition and books. And 4, investment. It came with a promise that if I one day received a terminal degree in my field, it would repay tens of thousands of dollars on my educational loans. With the support of the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship, I wrote, composed, and produced 2 full-length musicals at Yale. This work would not have happened otherwise. It was unthinkable that I could have that much time to write during a summer. I still graduated with a good amount of debt. I had about $300 or $400 a month in student loan bills, but I also graduated with an in-depth portfolio of creative work that would help me pave my path towards my first completely underwritten degree. I decided to pursue an MFA in playwriting at Brown. I had also been accepted to Columbia and NYU, but at those schools I would have had to pay about $30,000 each year, and I knew I couldn't add any more debt to my monthly payments, and most especially not to write plays. Brown, by contrast, was a fully funded program, which meant that not only did I not have to pay tuition, but they actually gave me $14,000 a year in cash. This was through a Lucille Lortel Fellowship. This support was critical for some very similar reasons. 1, length. 2 full years of support to practice my craft and generate material. Once again, it didn't help me realize one phase of one project, it subsidized the next arc of my development as an artist and thinker. I experimented with my own kind of ritual theater. I tried dramatizing comic books. I wrote overly satirical plays. I wrote dramatically inert plays. Ideas yielded to new, I still do that sometimes, I try not to. Ideas yielded to ideas organically over time, and ultimately I began to write Eliot: A Soldier's Fugue, the play that I consider my first fully articulated work. Quantity. It was enough money that I only had to work part-time to keep my lights on, so almost all of my time could be dedicated to writing. And quality. Once again, the funding didn't require that I account for how it was spent. I didn't have to buy office supplies or pay for production costs. I paid my rent. Writing is a muscle. It gets stronger, but only when it's rigorously used. My muscles got stronger. All that Philadelphia stuff I talked about, that was what I wanted to write. But at Brown, I learned how I wanted to write it. A few months after I got my MFA, I let the folks at the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship know. Soon after, I received a letter from Sally Mae saying that my college loan had been paid almost in full. My payments dropped to $90 a month. I was nearly debt-free. I moved to New York, and that same month had my first meeting with producers of a show called In the Heights, who were looking for a playwright. Finally, my first professional unrestricted grant. It came at a timely moment in my career. I had already written a little-known experimental play called Eliot: A Soldier's Fugue, and despite it being a finalist for the Pulitzer and despite getting good reviews, it remained basically unknown and brought in next to no income. And in contrast, I had also written In the Heights, which was a big commercial success, ran on Broadway for almost 3 years, and is now being produced around the country. Still, even though Heights was a more prominent work, there was something about Eliot: A Soldier's Fugue I was not ready to let go of. What I had written there felt so uniquely me, a combination of my cousins from El Barrio, my love for Bach preludes and fugues, of my Puerto Rican roots and my urban multi-ethnic lens. I wanted to go back to that, feel again how I felt when I was writing that play. I decided to turn it into a trilogy about the coming of age of a young Puerto Rican man. One problem, I needed income. I was getting offers to write for film and TV, offers for high visibility projects that paid beyond well. And yet here I was dreaming of earning scraps for this scrappy little project, my trilogy. I had a decision to make. Take the TV gig, take the film script, and commit myself to those full-time writing responsibilities for about a year, maybe 2, and know that rent would be paid for and childcare would be paid for, or follow my fancy and be less sure. It turns out I did not have to make that decision. The United States Artists gave me a $50,000 fellowship. $50,000 of money I could spend however I wanted simply for being me. My agents fumed as I turned down the Hollywood gigs. And I got to work on my trilogy. Again, this support was crucial for 3 reasons: length, quality, and quantity. $50,000 I could spend as I chose. That was almost 2 full years of rent in New York. 2 years of full-time writing. I completed Water by the Spoonful and began The Happiest Song Plays Last, a trilogy that was 8 years in the making but was finally in its home stretch. Plays take time. Creating a body of work takes longer. The full arc of an artist's life takes the longest. My plays have taken anywhere from 2 years to 15 years to write. And it's not just me. It took August Wilson 6 plays to write Fences. In Tennessee Williams's case, it took him 7 plays before he could write The Glass Menagerie and A Streetcar Named Desire. In the case of Arthur Miller, he needed 9 plays before All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, and The Crucible were ready to speak. It took Eugene O'Neill 27 plays before A Long Day's Journey into Night. Tuition and rent money made all the difference for me. They supported not just one play, but my confidence and craft as I invested in a life telling the story of my people and my community. You can write a project proposal to bind a book of poems, but you can't write a project proposal to think up the poem. That happens in a different way. The imagination is not a curated timeline with predetermined expenses, and the poetry book cannot be bound without the poem being written. And the poem cannot be written without the unpredictable merger of imagination and life. And the imagination cannot be articulated without the hours, days, and years it takes to write draft after draft. Those alchemical connections that happen on street corners, those informal moments when art and community conspire, those long arcs of an artist's life and long pulse of a community's expression are worthy of investment, though that investment may be risky and less tangible. Those unrestricted funds may not have quantifiable, reportable returns on investment, but my cousin hand-wrote his first novel in prison. I saw him last night. He's out now, and he's just finished writing his 3rd novel. Adimu taught the West Philly kids the African legacy of improvisation. Kathy Chang danced for a more perfect union. And I'll be damned if I don't get those stories told. And if those stories earn a spot on this country's library shelf, and I've played some part in it, then you have too. It may not be tangible, but it is our history, and it is very, very real. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.